Real questions, real answers for real life. Come on in and pull up a chair. You're at 1850 Main Street with Michael Del Giorno and David Zanotti.
A lot of people these days want to talk about America having another civil war. Did we not learn our lesson the first time around? Dave is joined at the table today by Dr. Jeff Sanders from the Public Square.
Jeff, I have been so looking forward to this conversation, and I'm so glad that you stopped by here on 1850 Main Street. So let's put this together here. The whole idea of 1850 Main Street was to have a place for conversation, and it's got a tavern ring to it. You know, you come through the door, you hear the bell, you feel like you're there with family and friends, and there's got to be good food and good coffee along with it as well. But the idea is that we're getting together in the way that Americans have gotten together for a long time, in their local place of eatery or pub or whatever it might be, to talk about what's happening today and how it impacts all of our lives. So 1850 Main Street is just a few blocks away from the Public Square. There are two different kinds of communication that go out to our country. And you happen to be on the Public Square panel on a regular basis. But something you and I have never had the chance to talk about a lot is American history from that period of 1850 through the Civil War. And 1850 Main Street is named 1850 Main Street based on the premise that if you study American history and you go 10 years back from the outbreak of the Civil War, there was a chance to have stopped the Civil War from happening. But we failed as a country to do that.
Imagine if we had.
And the outcome, of course, was horrible, was simply horrible beyond imagination. So we sit here at 1850 Main Street on the pretense that there's a lot of people talking about Civil War right now. And there's almost a juvenile fascination with the idea from the American media. It's like sensational. Like, ooh, I wonder what that looks like. Let's push that button and see what happens. People who've studied history know you don't ever want to get a million miles within
you
that
don't want
button.
to push that, no.
So I wanted to bring you to the conversation because you've studied this period. So let's establish, we're going to do a couple of 1850s together, I think. So let's establish some credibility points. We're going to talk today specifically in a few minutes about a letter from someone who's a great-great-grandchild of someone that got a Civil War letter. So let's go back and put your credentials on the Civil War. If you had never studied the Civil War, which you have studied, and we'll talk about that, but if you never had studied the Civil War, you still got a little connection to that event in history, right?
A little bit. Yeah, so my great-great-uncle was General Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard. Now, he's no relation by blood. He married my aunt, Caroline Delon. And then his brother-in-law, who would have been my other great-great-uncle, was John Slidell, because he married Caroline's sister. And he was the Confederate commissioner to France. In fact, if you read in history about the Trent affair, there was a British ship called the Trent, and a U.S. warship pulled it over and took the two Confederate commissioners, or we would say ambassadors, off of the British ship. And one was John Slidell, one was my uncle. And then my cousins on my mother's side of the family all fought in the 1st and 8th Mississippi Cavalry. And I have some artifacts from the American Civil War that I use in my live Civil War presentation whenever I go and talk to churches or schools or, whatever, civic organizations. By the way, most of the time when I go and speak as a Civil War soldier, it's in Union blue, not in one of my Confederate uniforms. A lot of the speaking I do is up north, and so the Confederate uniform would not go over very well. But I give the same talk no matter which uniform I'm in. But I've been studying the Civil War since I can remember.
You kind of jumped over that great-great-uncle, though.
Well, Pierre Beauregard he really actually went by the name Pierre-Gustave Toutant, but he was from a home that they named Beauregard. He spoke only French until he went to West Point, and he wrote down Pierre-Gustave Toutant de, which means from Beauregard, and so they thought that was his last name, and he went by that for the rest of his life. but he ordered the first shots fired at Fort Sumter. He was credited with winning the first Battle of Manassas in 1861. He was in charge of the defense of Charleston. If you watch the movie Glory, which you will cry all the way through it, one of the best Civil War movies ever made, he was actually in charge of Fort Wagner, the Confederate fort that they were attacking, and all the other Confederate forts in that area. And then in connection with the story that we're going to talk about today, he was in charge of the Confederate defense of Petersburg in early June or middle June, 1864. After the war, he worked in railroads. He was with the Lottery Commission in Louisiana. And he also helped out with a new political party in Louisiana called the Reform Party. And he went around registering former slaves to vote. He was not a slave owner, even though he was part of the Confederate High Command. His wife did own some slaves, but he personally was not. And for the fact, I guess, that he was registering former slaves to vote, they took down his statue in New Orleans a few years ago.
So you've got some kin in that fight, but you've also got some genuine intellectual research for many, many years, which we want to talk about too. When do you first remember starting to study the Civil War? What were the first things you looked at?
There is a picture of me on the floor. I was about 18 months, and my mother is playing with me, and I have on a gray Confederate kepi. Of course, that would have been 1963 or 64. I was born in 62, and America was celebrating the centennial of the American Civil War, and it was not a shameful thing at all for anybody to wear a blue Union kepi or a gray Confederate kepi, and so they have one on my head. But one of my earliest memories was I went to go see...
Well, wait a minute. Most people don't know what a kepi is. What's a
kepi is the French word for cap. When you think of a Civil War hat, it looks almost kind of like a baseball cap, and it's got the circle part kind of pointing up, and then you've got a short visor. That's one style. A forage cap was much more popular, and then many of them wore slouch hats. There's a whole bunch of stuff connected with that, but probably my earliest memory of understanding the horror of the Civil War was when I was 8 years old. And my sisters, and I think my mother went with us, took us to go see Gone with the Wind. It was being re-released. So this was 1970. And I just got into the story. Rhett Butler was so funny and so wonderful. And everything in the story was just so amazing. And I was just into it. And then halfway through the film, the South lost. Now, I knew that I was a Southerner. I knew that, my ancestors wore gray. I understood that much. And I was so horrified. This is 1970. The Vietnam War was not over. It was still well underway. I looked at my sisters and my mother and I said, "We lost? Americans lost? How can Americans lose? Americans can't lose." My father was in World War II. My grandfather was a sailor in World War I. Americans don't lose. I'm an American. I'm a Southerner. How can an American lose? And so from that point on, I was just hooked on, why? How did that happen? And at first I was very, very much angry with people from the North and, you Yankees, Dave Zanotti, and all that kind of stuff. But the more
Hey, before you go there, hang on a second.
I know your ancestors weren't even here.
My people weren't even considered a part of this country when they came here in 1912.
That's right.
So we didn't have a dog in that fight.
That's right. But as I grew older, in my later teens, and I read more about people like Sherman and General Grant, who were actually very, very compassionate men and did what they thought was right to end the war as quickly as it could be ended so that it would end the bloodshed. I grew in my admiration for many of the people who were wearing blue. And to this day, I have nothing but admiration for many officers in the North, and I do not bear any grudge. In fact, I married a girl from Ohio, and I tell everybody that I'm married up.
So, Jeff, I know that you're also a trained theologian, and you spent a good number of years in the pastorate. and you spend a lot of time now in chaplaincies in the business community. And so you're I mean, people need to know your credentials. You're a very solid player in regards to the theological world and community. You talked about bearing a grudge. When you were raised, was there, I mean, yeah, I know that it's always been culturally the Yankees versus the Rebels. I get that part. And everyone kind of grew up one side or the other. That kind of had a pick. If you're an American, there was this war. You can't just run away from it.
Right.
But grudge, you used the term grudge.
Yep.
Was there really a grudge?
There was, and yet there was a lot of forgiveness also. And the forgiveness really began with the soldiers themselves. The forgiveness began on April 9th, 1865. General Lee leading the way, who is one of my heroes. He forgave his enemies starting that day that he surrendered his army. He had soldiers coming up and said, "We're going to fight them yet, General. We're going to run into the hills and into the forests, and we're going to keep fighting." He says, no, go home. Make your sons Americans. Read the book by Charles Braceland Flood, Lee, the last 5 years of his life when he was a college president, and example after example after example of how he demonstrated forgiveness to Northern politicians and Northern soldiers. And he bore no grudge against anybody black or white and did what he could to reconcile North and South, black and white. And yet there were still ignorant people who bore a grudge, and I was one of them because I was ignorant. I didn't know any better. I didn't look into the lives of Grant and Sherman and so many other great Americans who were from the North and what they did. And I didn't look into the lives of so many Southerners who had a Christian mindset and said, we cannot hate and bear grudges. Joseph Johnston, there's my prime example. One of the Confederate High Command, and he fought against Sherman throughout much of the war. And yet when Sherman died, the aged General Johnston went to his funeral. I'm going to choke up here because I want you to see this picture of there is General Johnston standing in a driving rainstorm at the grave of William Tecumseh Sherman. And he's standing there hatless in the rain. And somebody said to him, "General, you need to put your hat on. You're going to catch your death of a cold." And General Johnston said, "No, because if it were him standing here and I were in the grave there, he would do the same for me." Sherman was so compassionate to the surrendered Confederates. And I remember reading that and I said, well, that's the way forward. You love people, even if they are your enemies. You forgive. If you're bearing a grudge, you're only hurting yourself.
Thanks for stopping by at 1850 Main Street. We're glad you're here. Do you want to learn more about what's really going on behind the scenes in public policy? Tune in to the Public Square on over 200 radio stations coast to coast, or download the free Public Square mobile app from your app store. Just look for The Lamppost. Find out what America's talking about at thepublicsquare.com.
Let's take some time to talk about this article that we've come across, which is really fascinating. You sent it along to me. You picked it up off of PBS, and it has to do with a letter written by a Union captive to a Confederate soldier. And I'm wondering if you would take a minute and set this story up and put it in context. I'm going to ask you to actually read the letter. I'm going to talk about that for a while because I think it gives us a side of the Civil War that people just by and large are not, they're just not aware of. In fact, before we even get there, let me ask you this. Do we even teach the Civil War in any logical fashion any longer? I mean,
No.
We don't, do we?
We don't even teach American history. We teach social studies, which is not the same. But we don't even teach American history. We'll teach pop culture. We'll teach what's politically correct. The Civil War, as is taught today, was because the North was right and was against slavery, and the South was wrong, and they wanted to keep slaves. And the virtuous North vanquished the evil South. That's it. End of story. They leave out all kinds of inconvenient truths, like there were 4 slave states that fought for the North, and they weren't getting rid of their slaves anytime soon. And the slave trade was still going on in those states that stayed in the Union fighting for the United States. They don't talk about the free black slave owners in the South. They won't talk about it. It's not simply a cut and dry thing. And if you want to talk about slavery, we'll talk about slavery. But there was much more to the Civil War and the causes behind it than the issue of slavery. If you took slavery out, would there have been a Civil War? Probably not. But that was not the only issue and the only driving force to starting the Civil War and to killing off 700,000 Americans who didn't need to be killed.
I was reading recently in the work of Blaise Pascal, who is a Frenchman who wrote before the founding of the United States of America. And he was a jurist, a lawyer, an intellectual, a scientist, really quite legendary as a person of esteem in France. And he wrote a simple line that the worst of all wars is a civil war. And I thought to myself, now that's saying everything in a very, very few words. So the Civil War is a great American tragedy. We know that. And it's a tragedy for almost an endless list of reasons. It was a really bad idea. What's problematic is that a lot of people today are fascinated with the concept, and they throw it around like it's an experiment of, gee, I wonder what that would look like, or gee, I wonder what would happen if we did that again, or gee, is it inevitable that we're going there? It's the very reason we've started this program, 1850 Main Street, because 1850 was 10 years before the outbreak of the Civil War.
Can I tell you what it would look like? One snippet, one story?
Sure.
The Second Battle of Cold Harbor in June of 1864. 8,000 Union soldiers were killed outright in 30 minutes. Another 8,000 were wounded in 30 minutes. At the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse in May of 1864, they fought for 18 hours in a driving rainstorm, Lee's army against Grant's army, or George Meade's army. And when it was over, the bodies were stacked 12 deep. Not because people were picking them up and throwing them that way. It's because they were fighting on top of each other.
Wow.
That's one battle out of hundreds in a 4-year conflict that killed off 3% of our population. If we had another Civil War, it's going to kill off a whole lot more than 3%. You don't want to go there.
It's the worst possible idea. And thinking people and thoughtful people, caring people, and certainly people who proclaim Christian faith ought to be really concerned about this rhetoric and why, and not running away and hiding from it. So, well, there's an article that you sent me, this letter, and it's a letter written by a Union captive to a Confederate soldier. Set this up for us. Who were these people?
Well, this came about because of an Antiques Roadshow in May of 2023 at the North Carolina Museum of Art in Raleigh. And there was a woman there who brought a sword. She said it was from her great-grandfather, P.J. Johnson, whom the sword, and there was also a letter with this. And the sword belonged to Officer Johnson. He was a Confederate captain, I believe. Johnson was a captain for the Confederacy during the Civil War when he captured a J.E. Buckby, a Union captain from Michigan during the Battle of Petersburg in Virginia. And the Battle of Petersburg was in June of 1864. And there was a lot of trench warfare. In fact, our friend Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain was severely wounded in that battle, where he was shot in the right hip and it went across into his left hip. And I've actually seen that bullet that they pulled out of his body. I've seen that in the museum in Maine. So that night after Johnson had captured Buckby, he was nursing a wound received in the heat of battle. And the captive, Captain Buckby, the Union officer, treated the wound for him. And then later, Captain Buckby said, "Can I go take a bath in the river over there? You know, you get pretty dirty in battle, I suppose." And Johnson said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead. You know, no problem." So these simple acts of kindness, the article says, amidst the chaos of war, ultimately reunited the two men decades later. After the war, Johnson wrote to Buckby through the Detroit Free Press. So the Confederate officer wrote to the Union officer in a newspaper, hoping to return his former opponent's sword, which he had captured after the battle. So then many years later, Captain Buckby of the Union Army wrote to P.J. Johnson again. And he writes, P.J. Johnson, Esquire, Lenoir, North Carolina. Maybe I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. He said, "My dear sir, I hardly know how to express myself in writing to you. It is certainly a strange circumstance in a man's life to go through war and in later years write with only the kindest of feelings, or more with a feeling of kinship to the man to whom during the war you surrendered as a prisoner of war. I use the word kinship in a broad sense, for are not all Americans in a certain sense akin? I have had sent to me a clipping from the Detroit Free Press in which your communication was published, asking if I am still living, etc. I remember you and your courteous treatment the night of the 17th of June, 1864. If I am not mistaken, you had a slight wound across the back of your hand, and I turned some water over it to cool it off. Am I right? You say you have my sword. Friend Johnson, keep it. If you have boys, let it go to them as a trophy captured in a fair fight. I'm teaching my boys to respect Southern men who fought for their convictions, that I then thought I believed, what time has since proved, that the cause for which I fought represented the best interest of the whole country. They, on their part, were as honest in their convictions as I am in mine. And more, I tell them that it is my belief that having trusted to the issue of war, you of the South have accepted the result in good faith, and would today be as quick to rescind an insult to our father's flag. Am I not right in this? If you can so teach your boys, when the next war comes, your boys and my boys will stand shoulder to shoulder against enemies of our common country. I should be glad to hear from you. You certainly had a very taking way with you when last we met, and I presume you are still as companionable. I escaped after 5 months in prison and served through the balance of the war without again falling into trouble of a serious nature. I am married and have a family. I should be pleased to become better acquainted than was possible during the brief evening while we were together, and should you come this way, do not fail to call on me. I enclose my business card. Yours very respectfully, J.B. Buckby.
This conversation isn't over yet, so come on back next time and pull up a chair at 1850 Main Street. To help spread the word, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more, visit 1850mainstreet.com. We'll see you soon.